He hurt me and left me alone, but my decision changed everything. A real overcoming. That Saturday, I never imagined my life would be turned upside down. I woke up anxious, wanting the night to be perfect. I spent the day slowly getting ready, choosing a simple but pretty outfit, wanting to be right next to Lucas. We were going to a party thrown by a friend of his, something I imagined would be light, fun, a chance to be together, laugh, and have fun. But deep down, I was already carrying a weight I pretended wasn't there. For months, I'd felt something was wrong, but each time I convinced myself it was just me exaggerating. I made excuses for his behavior, justifying every rudeness, every disappearance, every off-color comment. I was afraid to admit I was in a relationship that wasn't good for me, because it seemed like everything we'd built up to that point would crumble. I thought if I tried harder, he'd go back to being the caring guy he'd been in the beginning. But that hope was poison disguised as affection. That night, I felt it more clearly than ever. It was like a movie was playing before my eyes, showing every moment I shrank to fit into his life. And I, tired, made up, and smiling on the outside, was there trying to believe that it could still work out. When we arrived at the party, everything seemed normal at first. I smiled, greeted people, and felt a little out of place because I barely knew anyone, but I maintained my composure. Lucas, on the other hand, let himself go in a way that made me uncomfortable. He paced around, drinking, laughing, hugging people I'd never seen before. I tried to keep up, but he made no effort to include me. It was as if I were just a detail in the landscape of his life. I tried to make conversation, to get him to introduce me, but I received quick, impatient responses. I felt that butterflies in my stomach you get when you realize you're being left out. At the same time, Clovis, his friend who always made mean jokes, started insinuating about my ex, Fabio. He spoke as if I were guilty of something, as if I were still stuck in the past. I smiled nervously, trying not to give him a reason, but inside I was in pieces. I wanted to disappear. It was as if everyone could see that I wasn't a priority at all, and that made me incredibly ashamed. The feeling of abandonment grew with each passing minute. I looked at Lucas, and he seemed in another world, enjoying himself, drinking, surrounded by people. I wondered why. I was there. I didn't want to be that person who causes trouble, but I also didn't want to be invisible. I tried to take a deep breath, go to the bathroom, look in the mirror. My face was beautiful, but my eyes were filled with sadness. Then I realized I was humiliating myself without realizing it, insisting on a space that was no longer mine. I remembered all the times I'd choked back tears when he'd talked about Fabio, all the awkward conversations, the arguments that ended with him playing, the victim and me apologizing. Deep down, I knew that wasn't love. It was dependence, a fear of being alone. But seeing it there, so explicitly, was like a punch in the gut. I began to feel angry, not only at him, but at myself, for having allowed it to get to this point. That's when Patricia showed up. She's my true friend, the one who isn't afraid to say things to my face. She looked at me and didn't have to say anything, but she said it anyway. "You don't deserve this," she said softly, but firmly. I almost cried right then and there. It was everything I'd been avoiding hearing, and hearing it from an outsider was like seeing the truth written on a sign. Patricia hugged me and said she was tired of seeing me belittled because of him. I felt a mix of shame and relief. Shame for being in that situation, relief that someone saw me and understood me. My legs felt weak, my heart racing. It was as if I finally had permission to admit that this was wrong. It was against that wall with the loud music and the noise of the people that I decided I couldn't take it anymore. It wasn't about the party, it was about everything. About every time I accepted crumbs thinking they were love. About every time I made excuses for actions that hurt me. I didn't cry there, but I cried inside. I felt a strange strength emerging alongside the pain. It was as if I had hit emotional rock bottom. And at rock bottom, there's nowhere to hide, only rise or sink. There, I chose to rise. I didn't know how, but I knew I had to. After that moment of shock, I spent a few minutes trying to process everything. The party continued as if nothing was wrong, but inside me it felt like a bomb had dropped. I looked at Lucas and felt a mixture of sadness, anger, and disbelief. How had I gotten here? I remembered the beginning, when he was affectionate, when he sent good morning messages, when he said he wanted to build a future with me. I clung so tightly to that beginning that I didn't notice when he started to change. Or maybe it had always been this way, and I just didn't want to see it. I remembered the times he'd pick on my clothes, the comments about my male friends, the senseless suspicions. I always tried to justify it by saying it was just being careful, that it was because he liked me. But now, seeing him having fun without caring whether I was there or not, I realized it was never about being careful. It was about control. It was about ego. And I'd let it become normal. It felt like being awake after a long sleep, but waking up like this hurts. It was like my heart had been beaten. I wanted to run away, but I knew if I did, he'd turn the story against me later. He'd say I was overreacting, that I didn't know how to have fun, that I ruined the night. I already knew the script. So I took a deep breath, held my tongue, and stayed quiet. But inside, my head was buzzing. I started thinking about all the times I'd skipped going out with friends because he didn't like me. All. The conversations I'd kept quiet to avoid a fight. All the times I'd accepted lame excuses. And I also thought about Fabio, my ex. I'd cut him out of my life, but Lucas always found a way to bring his name back, like a ghost haunting me. I realized that no matter how much I proved my loyalty, it would never be enough. Because the problem wasn't Fabio, the problem was Lucas, and his insecurity turned into disrespect. That was hard to admit. That night, I started noticing the little things. He laughed loudly with his friends, offered drinks to people he barely knew, but didn't ask if I was okay. He worried about impressing others, but not about taking care of me. It was in this contrast that everything began to clearly come together in my head. I deserved more than being a supporting character in someone's life. And it finally hit me when I realized I was there, at that party, just to avoid disappointing. I didn't want to be there. I wasn't happy, but I went anyway, because I was afraid he'd get angry if I said no. It made my chest tighten. How many times had I done things just to please him? How many times had I put his happiness above my own? That realization hurt, but at the same time gave me a strange strength. I began to think that maybe I could turn this around, not to save the relationship, but to save myself. When the party ended and we left, I was silent. He was drunk, laughing, talking nonsense, and I just thought in silence. I didn't argue. I didn't question. I didn't give him space to turn things around. I just stayed quiet, observing. Deep down, I had already decided I was going to change. It wasn't going to end there, in the middle of the night, because I knew he would try to manipulate, make a fuss, maybe even cry to convince me to stay. I knew every tactic, so I decided I would plan calmly, but I would free myself. And for the first time in months, maybe years, I felt a glimmer of hope. It was as if I had found a way out of that maze. It still hurt, still heavy, but there was a sliver of clarity showing me that I no longer had to accept it. Arriving home, I locked myself in my room and cried. It wasn't just a cry of sadness, it was a cry of release, of pent-up anger. I sobbed, remembering every time I swallowed my pride, every time I accepted being diminished, every time I blamed myself for things that weren't mine. I cried and trembled, but at the same time, I felt more alive than I had in a long time. It was as if my body was expelling that emotional poison. Between tears, I looked in the mirror and whispered to myself, "Enough." And I didn't just say it. I knew that enough was different. The next day, I woke up with a strange feeling, a mix of tiredness and clarity. My body ached from sleepless nights, pent-up tension, and unshed tears. But my mind was more alert than ever. I sat up in bed, drinking coffee, and began to think about everything objectively. I realized that every little episode with Lucas had been a warning, and I'd simply ignored it. I remembered the times he'd laughed at my insecurities, made snide comments about friends, and I'd pretended not to care. I remembered Fabio, how he always came up as an excuse or a reason for jealousy, and how vulnerable that made me. And I realized that the problem was never Fabio, never anyone but him and the way he treated me. It was painful to admit, but it was liberating. For the first time, I looked at my own story honestly, without trying to sugarcoat anything, and I felt I could change. I spent the day reflecting on my limits. I realized I could no longer accept feeling inferior, invisible, or humiliated by someone who claimed to love me. Every unanswered call, every snide comment, or indifferent attitude no longer had to be tolerated. I began mentally listing the things I would no longer accept: teasing about my past, unjustified jealousy, disrespect at parties, and most importantly, the feeling of not being a priority. The anger, Was there? Yes. But a different strength also emerged, a clarity I hadn't felt in a long time. I began to imagine myself saying enough out loud, setting limits without guilt, and for the first time I felt no fear. I realized I didn't need his or anyone else's approval to feel worthy. That was the day I decided to definitively cut off any contact that could harm me. I called Fabio and explained that I needed space, that it was time to protect myself emotionally, that there was no more room in my life for any doubts or insecurities. He was surprised, but understood. At the same time, I began to think about how to deal with Lucas. I couldn't simply disappear without facing what was wrong, but I also couldn't humiliate myself by asking for explanations or apologies. I needed to show with actions, not words, that I had value. It was strange to realize that the strength I needed was already within me, just waiting for the right moment to manifest. That day, I also spoke to Patricia and confessed everything. I told her about the humiliations, the fears, the shame, the times I kept quiet to avoid creating conflict. She listened to me without judgment and gave me simple but firm advice. Don't beg for respect. Don't ask to be treated well. Just walk away from those who don't value you. These words resonated within me. I realized that, for a long time, I had confused attachment with love, submission with care, and that everything I believed to be true love was nothing more than my expectations of someone who lacked the emotional maturity to treat me with dignity. It was that day that I truly felt a turning point. I began to make plans for how to set clear boundaries, how to prioritize my happiness, my sanity. I began to feel hope again, a quiet relief, a courage I hadn't known existed. I didn't have all the answers, nor did I know exactly how everything would unfold, but I knew I could walk without losing myself. For the first time, I felt I wasn't alone, because I prioritized myself, and that feeling of strength was new, strange, and liberating all at once. In the following days, I began to put everything into practice. I avoided situations that made me uncomfortable, and most importantly, I began to set boundaries with Lucas. It wasn't easy. Every message I left unanswered, every invitation I declined, felt like I was defying an invisible rule I'd accepted for years. But each time I did this, I felt my emotional weight lift. I began to realize that life could be light, that I could laugh without worrying about his reaction, that I could breathe without feeling guilty. Each small step was a silent but powerful victory. I was learning to trust myself, to believe that my well-being was a priority, and that I didn't need his approval to feel whole. During this period, Patricia became my safe haven. She was always there, listening to me, encouraging me. I started talking about things I'd never told anyone, like the feeling of humiliation at parties, the small daily manipulations, the constant insecurity. And for the first time, someone told me I was right, that I wasn't exaggerating, that my feelings were legitimate. This gave me the strength to look at Lucas without fear, to face difficult conversations, and, most importantly, to understand that true love doesn't hurt, doesn't diminish, doesn't humiliate. And I gradually felt that life could be different, that I could have respect and affection without sacrificing my dignity. A defining moment was when I finally found the courage to talk to Lucas about everything. I didn't yell, I didn't beg, I just spoke honestly about how I felt, about how his every gesture affected me, about how much his indifference and unjustified jealousy hurt. He tried to downplay it, as always, but I stood my ground. It was difficult. My heart was racing, and I felt fear, shame, and anger all at once. But I felt alive. For the first time, I refused to be manipulated. I refused easy excuses. I was putting my happiness above the fear of losing someone who never valued me as I deserved. After that conversation, I began to notice changes within myself. I no longer needed to justify myself, no longer needed to explain my feelings to him. Every choice I made from then on was mine, and mine alone. I started going out more, having fun with friends, investing in myself, and this brought me a sense of freedom I hadn't felt in years. I realized I didn't need to wait for anyone to value me, because I already knew my worth. And this realization gave me the strength to definitively cut negative influences from my life. Every step I took, every decision, was a building block toward my emotional independence. It was during this period that I understood that the most important thing wasn't whether or not to end the relationship, but to understand my own worth. I realized that love isn't suffering, that respect isn't optional, that I didn't need to sacrifice myself to please. And even though I felt fear and pain at having to walk away from someone who still held space in my heart, I knew I was choosing the right path. The feeling of relief was intense, almost physical. I started sleeping better, laughing genuinely, looking in the mirror without guilt. And there, in that moment, I finally felt I could be myself, without fear, without shame, without losing my dignity. Over time, I began to notice significant changes in my life. I no longer needed to measure my words. I no longer needed to apologize for existing. Every decision I made, every boundary I set, strengthened me. I could feel an inner peace I hadn't known in years. Gradually, anger gave way to mature acceptance. Understanding that certain people don't value us isn't our fault. It's just their reality. And this freed me from an absurd pressure I'd carried without realizing it. I began to value myself, to prioritize my well-being, to understand that my heart deserved respect, affection, and truth. My relationship with Lucas changed too, but not in the sense of returning to what it was. I realized that true change needed to come from me, not him. I started putting myself first, rejecting manipulation and empty excuses. Every conversation that used to make me anxious, I now handled with firmness, without fear of losing control of my own life. It was liberating to realize that love doesn't have to be suffocating to be genuine. I learned the difference between attachment and affection, between possession and respect, and this completely changed how I view relationships and myself. The most transformative moment was understanding that happiness doesn't depend on external approval. I began investing in myself, reconnecting with my friends, doing things that brought me pleasure. And I realized that this didn't diminish the love I felt. It only strengthened my self-esteem. I was afraid, of course. Afraid of making mistakes. Afraid of getting hurt again. But with each step, I realized I was capable of dealing with the consequences without losing myself. My sense of emotional independence began to solidify, and this was more important than any reconciliation or apology. Today, when I look back, I see how much I've grown. I see a woman who cried, who felt shame, pain, and fear, but who chose to put herself first. I see a woman who decided she would no longer devalue herself, no longer accept crumbs, no longer allow anyone to diminish her worth. The relief I feel is immense, but I also carry the memory of the pain as a reminder that I was strong enough to overcome it. It's a mixed feeling, but a true one, and it gives me the confidence to move forward. My name is Regina, and I'm sharing this because I want others going through similar situations to know that it's possible to bounce back. Pain doesn't disappear overnight, but the strength we find within ourselves can transform everything. Today, I feel more alive, more whole, and more aware of my worth. I'm not perfect. I still struggle with remnants of fear and insecurity, but I know I can choose my happiness every day. What seemed like the end was actually the beginning of my emotional freedom, and no one can take that away from me.